Welcome to another edition of Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. My name is Aljamal Binding. I'm the chair of the board of Movement Omaha for Race Equity. And on the show today, we have Dr. Pat Velasquez, who has been known to throw out some heavy light. And we've done a series of interviews on various topics. And I thought it was timely that we got together and talk about what's going on in our community, in our cities, in our states, as well as in our country related to some of the things that are impacting immigrants, Latinos, even people of color as related to this administration. And it's appropriate that we come out and share some of our observations, issues as related to these various topics. And we have a series of issues and questions we'll raise, and hopefully we'll help throw out some opportunities for people to get more involved and help challenge the status quo as it is. So, Dr. Velasquez, first, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I was born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska. I'm the grandson of Mexican immigrants that came from central Mexico to work in the meatpacking industry in the early 1900s. And so my parents also worked there. I was the first generation that did not have to work in the meatpacking houses and was fortunate enough to go to college, graduated from UNO, University of Nebraska at Omaha, with a degree in bachelor's degree in social work, should say, and then also a master's degree in education. I worked in education primarily as a professional in Omaha, including spending about 5 years as the executive director of what was then called the Chicano Awareness Center in South Omaha, which was a multi-purpose agency providing direct services but also community advocacy. I left Omaha in 1988 and moved to San Diego, California, right on the border, the U.S. Mexico border, and have been living here for about the last 35 years, I think now.
Wow, wow. Well, I'm
And
gonna
I also went back to school and completed a PhD in higher education here in San Diego. And so I spent 28 years working at a very racist institution, the University of California at San Diego, working in teaching subjects like critical race theory and also providing services to students.
Good. Very good. Well, thank you. You know, Patrick, one of the concerns that I have, and again, it goes to the crux of this interview, is there's been obviously a lot of discussion about what President Trump is doing related to his racist immigration policy. For those who are ignorant on the historical context of Chicano protests in Southern California, there's a history of relations between Chicano law enforcement. We're talking in terms of immigration, local police, sheriffs, you name it. Within the context of the territory once belonged to Mexico, what's going on today, and how are we able to deal with some of those issues?
It's a very important question, the historic context to all this immigration issue, and especially immigration on the U.S. Mexico border. And even though sometimes Trump doesn't mention, or Stephen Miller, the little weasel who's the architect of his immigration policy, they don't mention specifically Mexican people, but there's no doubt that Mexican origin people are the targets of the Trump administration's immigration policy, their deportation efforts. So it is remarkable, man, that even in California, I find this, but I'm certain that this is the case in Omaha and all other parts of the country, that people don't even know the historic reality that states like California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, parts of Colorado, Nevada, etc., were a part of Mexico's national territory all the way up until the what was called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 that ended the war, an illegal war that the United States started with Mexico in order to steal about half of their national territory. And it wasn't until relatively recently that I found out from some historical texts that when that happened in the 1840s, there were a number of people in the federal government of the United States that wanted to take all of Mexico's territory and incorporate it into the U.S. But they didn't do it because they didn't want to have all those Mexicans there.
Wow.
So they settled for stealing half of Mexico's national territory and then carrying out a campaign of genocide and land theft against the Mexicanos that lived in all those states as we know them then. And so that's the historic context. it's remarkable again when you see white people now in the United States saying that these people are criminals when they cross the border. These Mexicans are criminals coming here without documentation. When it was their ancestors from Europe, and I don't care what country they're from, it was their settler colonist ancestors that came here with nobody's authorization, nobody's permission, and stole all the land that they could get their hands on, committed genocide against native people, brought over slaves from Africa because they were too lazy to do their own work, and again stole half of Mexico's national territory. So this is the historic context, and so you have to really marvel at the hypocrisy and the ability for white folks to compartmentalize what they did when their ancestors came here, and now that they're here, try to turn around and say that people from Mexico have no right to be in this country. It's beyond absurd. So one of the things that we're talking about is the whole role of law enforcement in immigration. And so you can all go all the way back to about 1850. And I know, Ajamal, you and I talked at length about this book called Bad Mexicans that was about the border area in the early 20th century. But you had groups like the Texas Rangers and the early origins of the FBI in the United States that played the role of law enforcement that brutalized people of Mexican origin along the border in those days. And that has still continued throughout the entire 20th century. People like myself, anybody I would say of Mexican origin, especially as you get closer to the border, have to be taught from a very early age to fear and to hate the border patrol. We call them La Migra, the border patrol. So, I have a son, and this is a part of what we have to go through. My son is getting, when he was getting to be the age of about adolescence, I had to talk to him about what happens if you're confronted by local police officers. What happens if you're confronted by local gang members? What happens if you're confronted by military recruiters in school? And what do you need to do if you're confronted by immigration agents? So this is part of the subordinate status and conditions that Chicanos live in and have to deal with in this country. So, it's interesting. Just today I was reading on social media, we've seen Trump order the National Guard in to try and as his bimbo Secretary of Homeland Security, Noam, that she said they're supposedly trying to liberate California from the socialist leadership there, which is news to a lot of us who don't see Governor Gavin Newsom or LA Mayor Karen Bass as even remotely progressive, let alone socialist. But the fact that Trump has brought the Marines in and brought in the National Guard, somebody reminded me on social media today that in 1850, President of the United States Millard Fillmore sent federal troops, United States troops, to try to capture escaped slaves, black slaves from the South that had made it to the North and hopefully freedom. And Fillmore sent in the troops, the United States troops, in order to try to capture those slaves and return them to the slave owners in the South. So, same thing, same pattern over 100 years apart, but here we are.
By the way, Pat, I want to ask you, and again, it goes back to the book you reviewed to call Bad Mexicans that we both reviewed and had extensive discussion on. Some of the stuff you just shared, the history of that, were you taught that in your schooling in OPS or the University of Nebraska at Omaha or elsewhere? Because how do you learn all this stuff you just shared?
No, of course not. We were never taught that in the Omaha public schools. And I would also say that here in San Diego, where you would think that the educational system would be more transparent and honest, authentic in what they teach, I can tell you that my son, I had a direct conversation with his social studies teacher in middle school at the point in the curriculum when they were studying the United States expansion, as they called it, into the West. And he was very honest. He just shook his head and said no, that they didn't really teach anything about the war between Mexico and the United States, or especially the aftermath, what happened again, the genocide that was committed against Mexican origin people at the hands of white colonists. There's a scholar named Cristina Beltran who wrote a really good book recently about um, the brutality against Mexican origin people and Native Americans, of course, on the border regions. And part of her thesis is an expression that you hear often now, which is cruelty is the point, right? That white folks in those days, they defined their freedom by their ability to steal land from Chicanos and Native Americans, lynch Mexicanos, or simply kill Mexican people and throw their bodies in a ditch or a field, and there were no consequences for them. And to them, to these white colonists, that meant freedom. And so that's what we're seeing again today is the white folks who come into our neighborhoods um, as staff of law enforcement agencies like the sheriffs or the local cops, and especially immigration. Um, they are rejoicing in their freedom at their ability to brutalize people of Mexican descent and deport us not only to Mexico, but El Salvador or any place else they feel we might belong.
You know, as you mentioned that, it just hit me that one of the reasons they didn't want me teaching in Black Studies or in the School of Social Work is that when you talk like this, you raise issues that make some Karens and Beckys nervous, or you got these milquetoast folks who can't deal with history. They get scared or they get guilty or whatever, so then they want to get rid of the messenger. And so most of the stuff we hear in some of our academic institutions, I understand in Omaha, many of those programs, whether it be multicultural affairs at UNO, as you knew back in the day, they have eliminated it. They've gotten rid of the diversity programs. Black Studies only got like 3 full-time professors. The white professor was there, accused the black chairperson of harassing her. So she got a slew of people to go against the department and people who hired her from out of town. So you got a whole university system that is trying to whitewash our history, and most people don't know about that. But I'm going to switch up and ask you a different question if I can. Is that in regard to the social history stuff you just shared, what are the practical economic dimensions of Mexican American migrants to California? And do much Chicanos consider undocumented Mexican migrants part of their community? Because one of the concerns I see in Omaha is the Latino center in the Midland is quiet as a church mouse. Many of the so-called compadres and people I know who should be speaking out about homeland security and separating families and moms and dads from children, they should be out in the front lines pushing back. LULAC, they're quiet as a church mouse. They fly their flunkies in Omaha for a photo op. But my question basically to you is, going back to the question is, do Mexicanos consider undocumented Mexicans as part of our community, our family, as we would say, La Raza?
Mhm. Yes, and as you mentioned, there's more than one dimension to this. There's this whole historical and social dimension where, when my grandparents came here from Mexico, they didn't have any authorization. They were recruited to come here and work, again, the kind of jobs that white folks didn't want to work. And so this is still what's happening today. And, I'll say unauthorized, not illegal. Nobody's illegal, but the unauthorized immigration from Mexico has been going on, needless to say, for decades now. And so if you come to a city like San Diego, you will find a real distinct niche in the economy for Mexican immigrants, whether they have authorization or not. If you go to a hotel in San Diego, and every person working in that hotel to clean the rooms and clean the hallways and so forth is Mexican or Latino, usually women, right? And so white folks don't want to do that kind of work. Needless to say, the same is true of the agricultural fields all over California and the Southwest, the meatpacking industry, restaurants. Most of the kitchen staff are also immigrants, most of them from Mexico. And so those of us that have any degree of humanity living in a city like San Diego, we recognize that that's an important part of the economy, right? And nobody's going to begrudge the folks that do that kind of work. I think most of us are very grateful that they're out there picking the food that we eat. And if they didn't do it, nobody else would. They would have to get somehow. It would cost a hell of a lot more money to buy these products or to go out to eat in a restaurant or stay at a hotel if that labor wasn't there. So again, this has been going on for so long that I think most people in San Diego recognize that this is what makes the economy work.
By the way,
And
Patrick, what's the population of San Diego in terms of Hispanics and whites, African? What kind of numbers you got out there?
I would say probably in the county of San Diego, Chicanos and other Latinos are probably about 35%.
Okay, got you, got you. You know, one thing that I want to come to, and I think is probably part of this conversation, Trump has invariably contributed to the political consciousness of raising a generation of how mean that Europeans could be, and particularly uh, people who have the same mentality of racism and so on. And we do see some Chicanos who are obviously concerned about this, particularly some of the young people. And my question, again, I alluded to LULAC, Latinos in the Midlands, some of these bystanders who haven't busted a grape but don't have evidence of challenging the system, either publicly or even privately or organizing. And are there civil rights groups that you're aware of on the national, local level, and maybe in California you may have it, who are pushing back at some of this craziness that you just got to describing?
I think what I've seen most directly is folks protesting, really literally taking to the streets. And in this last weekend, just a couple of days ago on Saturday, when there were, I think, thousands, at least a couple of thousands of protests across the country, the so-called No Kings protests against the authoritarian plutocracy of Donald Trump and his minions, that we had the official, sort of semi-official count of protesters here in San Diego was about 60,000 people, I believe, which is one of the biggest protests from what people say, that's ever taken place in San Diego. So that was heartening to see. People are going out on the streets, and even if all they're doing is marching and holding signs and so forth, it doesn't immediately create change, but what it does is it creates more consciousness. I don't think there's any doubt about this. And Ajmal, we saw this in the mid 1990s here in California when there was another little scrawny weasel named Pete Wilson, a blatant racist.
That was
Which,
was he the governor or was he
yes, he was running for governor and won governor of California.
that's what I thought. I remember the name.
And he did it primarily by running on a platform saying he was going to stop Mexican immigrants from coming to California.
Wow.
Of course, it was a farce because, as we all know, immigration law is enforced at the federal level, not
Right.
the state level. So he had no power whatsoever. There was a popular proposition passed that it was called Proposition 187 in California, that, among other things, would have made it a law that teachers would have to call immigration on their own students and
Wow.
report their own students and their
Teachers.
families.
That's
So
crazy.
it was eventually ruled unconstitutional because, again, it conflicted with federal responsibility for immigration enforcement. But that guy, Pete Wilson, probably did as much as anybody in the 1990s to increase the political consciousness of Chicanos throughout all of California. And one thing that happened was that there were a lot of folks who had been in the United States that came as immigrants from Mexico that were legal, but they never became naturalized citizens. They didn't care about voting. It just wasn't a priority for them. But once they saw what Pete Wilson was doing and the danger that he was creating with all this xenophobia, there were huge increases in the numbers of legal residents of the United States from Mexico that became U.S. citizens, registered to vote, and began to take part for the first time in the political
Wow.
process.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, so I have no doubt that that same phenomenon is going to occur here among young people. If you watch the news, at least here in San Diego, there were a lot of very young Chicanos, Latinos out in the streets in these protests. And some of them were saying, yeah, this is my first protest that I had to be out here. So they're developing a level of political consciousness that would not have happened if it wasn't for all this repression.
You know, it reminds me of the 60s and the 70s. Sometime when the shoe pinches, you have to pull it off. And at the end of the day, sometime you have to go through fire to get out of fire, you know? So basic metaphor is that you literally, you don't know what it's about until you go through it and you look at what our ancestors and forefathers and mothers went through back during the enslavement, lynchings, and so on. But, you know, it reminds me of the recent incident that happened with the U.S. Senator of California where he was manhandled and thrown around. And then some said in the media, you should have told everybody he was a U.S. senator. Well, you shouldn't throw people around and abuse them, regardless of how you arrest them. And here was a U.S. senator. My question back to you is, uh, what does that say about the abuse that we've experienced as Black folks or Latinos or Natives or Asians at racist Klan members who are inside embedded in our police department, our sheriff department, as indicated by the killings and the what they call justified homicide because I was afraid for my life? Are you serious? I mean, I cannot begin to tell you in Omaha the number of people of color, particularly African Americans, who were murdered and not one police officer spent a night in jail in the history of maybe 90 years in this city. So my question to you is, this U.S. Senator, what was that all about? I mean, what did we become when you take some of the highest people in our country and you beat them up and put them on the ground and make them kneel like they're begging to these saltines?
Yeah, that was again. I would say first of all that that's crap. The idea that they didn't know he was a U.S. senator. This did not happen in Washington D.C. It happened in a federal building in California. Okay, there's only two United States senators from California, same as every other state in the union.
Right.
So if you're working in a federal building and you don't know who Alex Padilla is and you don't know what he looks like, you got no business in there, man. And so that's crap that they didn't know who he was. And it did show up in the video and the audio that he said clearly, I'm U.S. Senator Alex Padilla, just before he was grabbed and thrown out of the room and, as you say, knocked to the ground and handcuffed. So goes back to what I was saying earlier. You can bet that all across this country, we have to be honest, man, all across this country, there are white folks who laughed at that and celebrated it and said, again, this is our freedom, right? We have the freedom to abuse physically a United States senator as long as he's Mexican, right? We can do that. And like you said, man, there are no consequences for the FBI agents or the Homeland Security staff that manhandle him. There will be no consequences for that. And so when you come right down to it, it doesn't matter what your status is. I'm sure we remember, Ajamal, when the Harvard professor
Gates, yeah, Louis
yes,
Gates,
was abused by police and arrested
and his front door of his
at
house.
his front door trying to get into his own home.
HD.
So again, it doesn't, if you're Mexican or black or Native American, Puerto Rican, it doesn't matter what kind of credentials you have or staff you have. I'm going to resist the urge to repeat a racial slur, but that's how white society views them.
Well, Malcolm said the same thing when he was debating with that PhD from whatever, some Ivy League school. He says, you know what these, and he used the word, you know what these crackers call you? I'm just quoting his words. He used the word, you know, he cracks on them. And he said, basically, they call you the N word. So I don't care how much education you get. And Oprah Winfrey, when she went to Switzerland to buy that expensive purse, they wouldn't let her look at it. I mean, Oprah Winfrey could buy the whole store. And she came back and got a backlash from the white Beckys and Karens that she shouldn't have cited that being a millionaire, billionaire she is. So it goes back to that mentality that we're supposed to just lay it out and accept it. The other thing you didn't talk about, Pat, is related to our history as people of color across the world. But in Australia, they killed many of those Aborigines like they did like they did Native Americans. And most of the people don't know that not one of those white criminals who came from Europe when they went to settle, I guess, in Australia, they shot so many of those Aborigines that their numbers became small, like the Native Americans. And you got these Jewish people walking around here saying what we did to natives through the Trail of Tears was not considered a Holocaust or genocide. And again, when you destroy that many people, their language, their culture, and you can get away with killing them, if that isn't genocide and a Holocaust, I don't know what is. And you got these Negroes and these Teal Taco Uncle Toms walking around here talking about we should be nonviolent and so on, which leads me to another question, because we got a whole group like that in Omaha. Some people are saying that the Trump protesters should be nonviolent. What is the use of violence in the formation of the United States American Revolution? What about Trump's formal approval of part of violent insurrectionists in January 6, 2021? So let's talk a little about this violent thing as
Yeah.
we unpack this paradigm.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. It is curious to see that, again, I saw LA Mayor Karen Bass, I saw Alex Padilla himself encouraging people, yeah, exercise your right to protest, exercise your freedom of speech, but do it in a nonviolent way. Well, if we look at what happened to the violent insurrectionists of January 6th of 2021, um, man, that was those folks are considered heroes now
Right,
in society. They were all pardoned by Trump on his first day in office.
right.
And so some of them are suing the folks that arrested and convicted them. So they're probably going to make a lot of money off that. I'm sure others will write books about what they consider their heroic efforts. So if you can try to overthrow the government, crash and break into the United States Capitol building, kill police officers as they did, and then your society rewards you by considering you heroes and patriots, then why don't we have the same right to commit violence if necessary? It's interesting to me. I'm reading a book right now on a group of revolutionaries in South America in the country of Uruguay way back in the 1970s and the struggles that they went to internally, the debates they had amongst themselves about the use of violence, right? And I'm somewhat familiar from studying Cuban history what happened with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara in terms of, again, this question of what sort of violence is revolutionary and what sort of violence is not, what sort of violence is abusive that we should avoid. Um, I myself certainly would not advocate violence against innocent people in a protest. And I realize you can get into a long debate about who's innocent and who isn't. And I also don't think it's a real revolutionary act to destroy the private property of working class people. Now you get into private property of wealthy capitalists, that might be another issue. But the other thing is we have to remember, and see, people seem remarkably to lose sight of this, that the United States of America as a sovereign country was founded on violence,
Right.
right? Our so-called American Revolution, um, against the British government, the so-called colonists, they didn't have peaceful protests against the British. They didn't ask for meetings with the British or dialogues with the British. They picked up the gun and started a revolution that led to the United States of America.
Right.
So we have to remember that this country was founded on a foundation of violence and that it can be a legitimate means of creating change, given the appropriate circumstances.
It reminds me of Malcolm X. Malcolm X talked about, I will be treated as you treat me. And oftentimes they picked him as a violent person, which he'd never committed violent acts against anyone. He just basically said, if you come to me a certain way, I'll come back at you the certain way. I love peace. And so it brings me to this whole issue of, and again, it's not part of our topic, but Trump is actually, you saw in California, it was in Florida where you have the police officer, the sheriff said, if people protest, they're going to do certain things to them. You come at me and block my way, I'm going to kill you. And they're saying some stuff, and I don't consider it rhetoric because it was made by a whole group of people who look like Klansmen in military or law enforcement uniforms. But the other thing I noticed, Patrick, was in California, they had police officers on horses hitting people who were just walking down the street with sticks.
Mm.
And so at the end of the day, if somebody hits you with a stick and you defend yourself, are you wrong? I mean, nobody has a right to put their hands on you unprovoked like they doing. But it's
Yeah,
just,
I saw a video of a cop on a horse, and the horse was literally trampling somebody.
yeah. The United
And
States, California, I
yeah,
think it was California was
it
happening.
was here. It was in Los Angeles. Yeah, just
Wow.
recently.
I was startled.
So,
And
and I think we saw the video. Even I believe Biden was president at the time. I could be wrong about that, but there was a border patrol person, staff member on a horse when immigrants from Haiti were trying to cross the Rio Grande, and this guy, this immigration agent on a horse, did the same thing, hit the guy with the stick and then trampled him. And as people said, it brought back all kinds of images of slave owners
right.
that to their slaves on a routine basis.
You know, one of the things, and I'm going to come bring some of this back to Omaha, and I'm looking about, we had immigration, or we call it INS folks, as well as Homeland Security, going into the packing houses in Omaha. They've gone to some of the factory places, even restaurants, and arrested people. And some of the people were legal citizens or whatever, residents, you name it, and they just picked them up because they were brown skinned. I don't know if they arrested any white people or black people, but they were aimed at specific groups. Then I saw also a statement where Trump was saying, let's not go there. But my point question is you, who in the city has spoken out against such racism in Omaha or in San Diego when you see that stuff happen?
Yeah,
No.
to me, I have not seen, and you're probably in a better position than me to actually to comment on that. Again, this goes back a long ways. This is what I was talking about in terms of a niche in the meat packing industry where people don't want to do that kind of work. And so you've got migrants, some of them unauthorized, to be in this country to work in the meatpacking industry. And who's going to do that if they don't do the work? But I don't know, Jamal, what do you see there in Omaha, man? Is it
I've seen some functionary states, but I also know our police department is corrupt and dirty and have been hit with so many complaints in the past few years. They have done nothing. So I think they speak on forked tongue, to use a Native American expression. They basically are saying in public that they will not cooperate with these ICE agents or these, the Homeland Security people. But you and I both know that the FBI is in bed with each other. They're all white. There's nobody black or Hispanic of any substance in any of these departments. I know Greg Gonzalez worked for the police department. He called hell when he turned and became over in the Douglas County working as a 911 controller there and all that. But you and I, when we were around, I didn't know Greg or anything back then. But my point is, I can't think of a lot of movement that's pushing back at this incident. And I know there's a lot of white liberal organizations say they're working behind the scenes. But again, when the family's deported and the family's traumatized, can you imagine having your little boy or girl and all of a sudden they put you on in the paddy wagon, as they would call it, and take you to another place and then put you on a plane or whatever they do to get you out of the country. And what happened to your kid? They don't care. And then we heard under the previous administration, those kids were locked up and treated like criminals themselves. So my point is, Omaha is no better than these other racist cities and towns because they're doing the same thing. And again, we're going to people who are working. It'd be different if they said up front, like they said, we're going to get those little convicted criminals who are off the streets who ran away, or those people who were felons. But we're talking about law-abiding people who are trying to support their families and trying to have a better way of life. And then we do that. And then all of a sudden you see these billionaires come out and say to Trump, well, you got to be careful. You're cutting in our profit margin. I mean, what kind of crap is that? But hopefully these conversations, these issues, Patrick, will help raise the sleepy people who've been sitting on the sidelines, because at the end of the day, nothing from nothing leaves nothing. And if we don't push back at these racist, clan-infested organizations, white supremacists, daughters of Confederates who work in county and city government, we're going to get the same old juvenile justice crap that's going on. So I think we got to begin to start talking, making coalitions and pushing at that. I was going to come to something else that we talked about. Do you think it's going to take us years to undo some of this stuff? Because again, you and I have seen and experienced some trauma by just being in the educational system where they insult you, they talk about your parents, your language, you name it. But do you think what we've been seeing now in the treatment of people of color, particularly Latinos in this conversation, is going to take years for us to get out of this trauma that they're inducing upon our communities and our people?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and something that I think as people of color, as Chicanos, as blacks, Native Americans. We really need to process this and talk about it in terms of our long-term strategies going forward. Because I'll give you one example. That's the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education. And so some of us might think, well, when Ronald Reagan was president, the Office of Civil Rights did not do anything to enforce civil rights in the education field, right? But then what happened when Bill Clinton was president for 8 years? Did the Department of Education and Office of Civil Rights really do anything? I don't think they did. I remember working at the University of California, San Diego, again, a thoroughly racist institution, and we did write letters of complaints. We filed specific formal complaints with the Office of Civil Rights for the way that they excluded Chicanos and African Americans at UC San Diego. And at that time, Barack Obama was president, and the Office of Civil Rights did not do anything. So my conclusion is that kind of bureaucracy is absolutely useless. So I'm sure there'll be an inclination if we should end up getting a Democrat elected president in 2028. I'm sure there'll be an inclination to say, well, let's rebuild that. Let's get it back to the way it was under Obama. But we have to remember that it was never any good, man. It never really had any teeth, and it never really did anything. And one of the things that people have been moaning about is the elimination of USAID because of Elon Musk's reductions, right? And I certainly don't like the idea that the United States is not providing foreign assistance, food assistance to countries that need food. But USAID was also involved all over Latin America, and I'd be willing to bet in Africa, certainly in Cuba, trying to create regime change over the years. It didn't matter who was president. USAID was trying to overthrow the Cuban government and install somebody in there who would be a lackey of the United States.
Wait, hold on, Patrick. You're saying USAID was in Cuba at some point? I didn't know that.
Oh, they had a program under which any United States citizen, including you and I, we could have written a proposal for a grant from the United States government through USAID if that grant helped to overthrow the government of Cuba.
And use USAID as a front.
It worked hand in hand with the CIA.
I did not know that.
It also was directly involved again. There was a branch of USAID called the Office of Public Safety. Funny enough, acronym OPS, right? And,
OPS. I call them OPS.
They were involved in countries like Uruguay. In the book that I mentioned, this is detailed and documented. They were involved with training the police in Latin American countries to be as oppressive as the police officers here in the United States.
I did not know that.
So that was part of the mission and function of USAID as well.
It brings me to the ideal and the issue of, and I guess it's part of this conversation also, is that many Africans are now saying some of the funds that were supposed to send to their countries was used as bribes indirectly, and many of those USAID officials lived high on the hog. So, for example, when I was in Botswana, there was a woman named Shirley who lived in a town that I lived in, Labatsi, and I was getting a salary like $150 a month to live on, and she was getting like maybe 3,000 US dollars a month, plus all her expenses paid. But to add insult to injury is that when I finished my 2 years of Peace Corps, they asked me when I want to join, and no, I want to go back home. But my point was, I could have made almost tenfold my income as a USDA official doing nothing because they're basically vacationers. And then the other thing with Shirley, she's an African American, so I got to know some of the details because she was opening with Sharon. But 2 points. One is they gave them so much allowance that she could ship her car back to the United States. I mean, they gave her like a traveling thing. She has a crate where she can ship her whole, paid for by the U.S. government. But what pissed me off about her is when I was there, I gave her a purse from my mom, a nice leather purse and a little, care package to send home. Girlfriend got back to Alabama where she's from, and she kept them. So I think of all you people as thieves, even though she was African American. I thought she was beyond the curve. She became indoctrinated with their behavior. I still talk about don't give stuff to somebody who's in the country just because they look like you think they'll take it home to your relatives. I want to switch up because I know we got a limited time here, and I want to ask you specifically about issues that we are in a very crazy time in this country. And there are some of us who have given up hope, Patrick. We really think there's no hope for tomorrow because we still have Trump for 3 more years. Uh, what do you think we can do about some of the things we've talked about? Because I know our educational system is shambles. An old chancellor is scared of her shadow. She's capitulated. They've eliminated all the people who had a semi-tongue. Everybody's going in hiding. I think there's like in the Nazi era. People are just scared. And my question basically that we're asking ourselves is, what can we do? And is there hope for us to have solutions to some things we talked about?
Yeah, it's one of those things I think where we need multiple strategies going forward. There's a lot of things that we have to work on and even just discuss in our communities. One basic question is our future within the Democratic Party, and I don't think that um, I don't even know if the United States is going to survive as a country. I don't really think it should. I think we'd all be better off if the United States broke up into separate regions, if not separate countries.
Wow.
But clearly, the Democratic Party is dysfunctional, especially when it comes to advocating for the rights and the progress of people of color. So we have to figure out some kind of different political strategy. And it's like people say, I think we have to think globally and act locally. So we have to look at everything that's going on in the world and try to learn as much from that as possible. But um, on a day-to-day basis, I think our best efforts are located locally. And I know for myself and folks like me in California, it's a lot different than it is in Omaha, where we have greater numbers here and we have a longer history here, and there's a longer history of organizing as well. But I think it also takes me back, Jamal, to somebody I know that's pretty near and dear to you. I remember a documentary about Stephen Biko
Right.
in South Africa, and they showed him working with a school system that he and a number of blacks in South Africa were implementing. And the narrator in the documentary asked him, "Well, how do you do this, man? Like, given all the repression of the white minority government, how do you do this?" And he said, we come to work every day and we do our job as if white people didn't even exist. And so we have to continue to do the right thing and what's best for our young people in particular. I am an educator, I'm an educational advocate. And so that's what I continue to think we need to work with students. We need to try to reach students. We need to try to continue reforming everything in the public institutions of education from K through 16. This didn't change when Trump was elected. We had an advocacy struggle to empower Chicanos even when Joe Biden or when Barack Obama was president. We still had that struggle here in California. And to some extent, it almost doesn't matter who's president because the folks here are still, they're not going to give up power. Man, I think some people might look at California and think, wow, it's a socialist state, right? That all the white folks out there are super cool and progressive and everything. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. There's just as many pockets of white supremacy here in California as there are in Nebraska. And so we have our work cut out for us, and we have to continue to work on a day-to-day basis to protect our rights and keep hold of who we are, remind ourselves who we are at all times, and also fight for our political lives as well.
As you mentioned that we had a workshop on Saturday where Potso talked about the legal system and education. He says in the history of Nebraska, we've only had 2 cases that went up to the court system on a high level. One was a one city, one school. In the busing case that my mother was involved, he says, if you look at other states, they had a lot more people of color fighting for civil rights. And then we had another person in the meeting who said that many of the African Americans on math in elementary school are only in the 99th percentile in terms of pass or the proficient level. And as you go through the whole system, our kids and students, for the most part, are being brainwashed, are not educated, and these white Beckies and liberals who are running these school systems hate black men, hate Latinos, Chicanos, Natives, Asians, because of the way they behave and who they don't bring to the table. Our kids are coming out ignorant as you could be. We just got through having a big parade. Over 2,000 people showed up for the Juneteenth parade, marched up and down the street, which nothing comes out of it. So talking about getting out of slavery, are you serious? You're still in slavery, as Malcolm would say. But my question, my issue that I'm concerned with, Patrick, is as Matthew once said, if you and I are not doing the teaching, y'all not doing the learning. So my question, this sounds weird the way I'm gonna phrase this to you. How do you multiply somebody like you or me in our system when it's so antiquated and racist and elitist and white supremacist? In other words, is there hope that we can get people out, or do we go back to our communities and educate? But can we expect to turn out advocates who can at least help protect La Raza, our people, and so on? Because most of these folks, I wouldn't lead them to fight out of a pillow fight. I mean, they're that bad. So how do you replicate people like us? Because it's obvious the few of us who can speak truth to power, we're both retired, but can we not be able to do this while we have a regular job? And again, I assume I've been on probation 4 times in 2 different organizations for being black and talking back, as they say. And I know you've faced some pushback working at the University of Racist situation. So my question basically is there hope for us producing replicating ourselves so that we can push back at this oligarchy, this fascism that we see emerging more so in this country? Oh, by the way, we invaded Iraq. I mean, yeah, Iran, and now we want to talk about surrendering, and we know who started the fight, the Israel government. Are you serious? You went and you bombed and killed innocent people. You don't expect them to come back at you? What is this, beginning of what? So this is a loaded question there, but how do we replicate the people at least can think and talk? Because I see a lot of ignoramuses in key positions, in positions they have no business being.
Well, first of all, we should probably clarify that the quote by Matthew was Matthew Stelly, not that guy in the Bible, supposedly.
Oh, man. Oh, that's funny.
So that was Matthew Stelly,
Right, right. Not Matthew.
educated black
Yeah,
advocate.
yeah, he based it up. If I'm not coming to the meeting, if I'm not in charge, and I got the flash, I'm not going to a meeting where I'm the only black guy in there unless I'm getting paid or teaching. Why should I be involved with somebody trying to teach me something? But
Oh, I've seen it from a number of ends. Yes, I think there is hope that we can continue to produce warriors. We can continue to produce advocates. I would like to think that I contributed to that somewhat during the 28 years I spent at UC San Diego. Again, a very toxic atmosphere. And this is what progressive educators talk about in terms of the dialectic, which is a concept largely taken from Marxist theory. But I think it really applies in this. You can have the most racist school or university or college, and sometimes the contradictions you can see are so blatant in those kind of institutions that it actually helps you to open the eyes of students
I see the
who are going
point.
through that.
That makes
And,
sense.
but of course, again, it takes some of us being on the inside and penetrating those institutions. I have certainly had mentors that made me conscious, when I was much younger. And I see educators all the time here in San Diego that are working really hard to try to have a positive impact on students. And not only just, there's a, this, Ajmal, as well as I do, that there are some educators, if you want to call them that think that their job is to put band-aids on Chicano students and black students. And I've done that too. Certainly, a lot of our students need band-aids, but it takes more than that, man. You've got to challenge the power. You've got to challenge policy and practice. And I think when students see you doing that visibly, that's consciousness raising in and of itself. And if you can work closely with those students, one of my favorite things at the university was to work with the student of color organizations and to give them feedback, give them support. And it wasn't like I really needed to even tell them anything. They already knew what needed to be done. They just needed some backup. And so, yes, I think there is hope that we can continue to produce the kind of advocates that our communities need. And maybe some of the blatant white supremacy and repression that we're seeing right now will actually contribute toward that.
I'm trying to go back to something you said earlier about the Civil Rights Office. I really think many of those officers should be eliminated. I think they're nothing but apologists. They're useless. Use example, we got the Human Relations Department in Omaha headed by a white woman who hate black men. You look at her department and so on. You won't see a black man walking around there. I sent her a letter a couple of times. She responded with one time with a perfunctory letter. The second time she never responded. I invited her to be on the show to talk about what they do to help people of color, and particularly discrimination. She didn't respond. They're afraid of that. The other thing is the Equal Opportunity Commission woman, who's a white Becky, and I don't want to insult them, but they act like they're members of Daughters of the Confederates, both of them. And again, they have no skin in the game. They don't live in our communities. They don't talk regularly to black folks or Latinos. They have no history but to make their overpriced salaries doing nothing. So I would say just get rid of it, because when you ask them about their data and what they've done, they have not produced their worth. And the reason I say that is because when I was on the board of Charles Drew as the chairperson, one of the white Jewish board members made a comment, who worked at Creighton University at the time, hospital. He said, doctors have to produce this much money above their income. And he says, basically, you have to measure different jobs by what they produce. And when you got these directors and these nonprofits making six-figure and $200,000 a year, and they're not producing one strategic plan, or they have no, excuse me, outcome, why do we need them? And they get mad at you and I when we say, get rid of them. In other words, how are you going to protect my interests when you don't have somebody at the table looking like me, or who can speak my language or understand my intonations when I switch up and speak Ebonics? So my point is, let's just cut to the chase. Get rid of those plexiglass office workers who have never been in our community. And I learned that in Douglas County. Many people I work with who did community outreach, they never came into North or South Omaha, except they go maybe to the Latino Center once a year for safe meetings and give out free toys and that. But at the end of the day, we need to just wake up and understand we can't expect the wolf and the foxes, Malcolm, to say the guard the hen house. And Malcolm was one of my greatest teachers.
Right. I agree.
You know, we got down to the last 5 minutes. I just want to ask you a question, and you said this earlier, and I want you to emphasize it to help us understand. Even though Latinos in some communities in California and the state and so on can be in the majority, they still don't have the political power. Why is that, and what can we do to reverse that, Patrick, from your vantage point as someone who spent many years not only in Nebraska but also in California? Because we used to think when the majority, you're going to be able to take over, except in South Africa. So explain that to me briefly. What's going on with that phenomenon?
Yeah, there's a number of variables that contribute to that. One is simply the demographics that Chicanos are a very young population. So we, along with other Latinos, I think if you look at all the Latinos in the state of California, about 80% of us are of Mexican origin. And then
Okay.
you have the other 20% from other Latin American countries. And some of them have had very different experiences than what people of Mexican origin have had, and that might contribute to a different degree of political consciousness. But also, we're a very young population. So even though Latinos make up a little over 40% of the California population, we represent over 55% of the high school graduates every year. So it's coming, assuming we can develop the consciousness, our political power and influence should be able to increase. You also have, though, on a more local level, like if you look at San Diego County, again, about 35% of the county is Latino, and the school age population is even higher. But the county is made up of the city of San Diego and several, like probably over a dozen smaller cities, smaller incorporated areas. And this is where, particularly in the area of education, it gets really dicey because you could have a small city in San Diego where Latinos make up only maybe 20% of the population. And so whites are going to control the school board.
Okay.
And if it's a very conservative area, like some of these areas, this is what happens, man, is that you end up with white folks establishing areas out in the suburbs. Again, they don't want to do the hard work that has to be done in restaurants and so forth. So Mexicanos have to go to those areas to live and do service work. And so when their kids go to school, the school boards are dominated by very conservative white supremacists. And of course, they will make sure that there's nothing about ethnic studies in the school curriculum. They will block the hiring of Latino teachers and so forth, and basically try to make sure that the system continues to create Latinos with a subordinate
Okay,
colonized
gotcha.
image. And so this is replicated all over the state of California, where we could say as an aggregate again, hey man, like we're 40% of the state, over 40%. But in these individual locales, it become much more difficult. Right now, if you look at the state legislature in California, um, Democrats control both the Assembly and the Senate. And it's really difficult for a Republican to get elected to a statewide office like governor or lieutenant governor or secretary of state. And there are a fair number of Latino elected officials, but even them, I think a lot of them have just sort of faked their way through the system and tried to be calm and quiet and tranquil and not ruffle any feathers, and that's how they end up getting elected to public office. So we have what's called the Latino Legislative Caucus, which you used the term milk toast earlier. I think that's a good description for this. For one thing, they're very insulated from the community. In 35 years of living here, I have never once seen the California Latino Legislative Caucus hold a public town hall and
Wow.
hey, we're going to come and take questions and dialogue with the local Chicano community here and move throughout the state doing that so we can figure out what the needs are. I mean, they're very insulated, and a lot of them are just like wow, man, like if I can get into the state assembly, then when I'm termed out, maybe I can get elected to the Senate, and then maybe I can get elected to the United States Congress. But I just have to keep being quiet so that I don't become known as a tranquil or a volatile figure. And we were talking about Alex Padilla, man. Alex Padilla is not anything close to a super progressive. I think this might have woke him up a little bit and made him realize how he's perceived. So I hope he's a little bit stronger. He's done some good things, man, and he said a lot of good things on behalf of our community. But he's about as far away from a radical or militant as you could possibly get, in all honesty.
You know that noted what it is, but I also want to say in Omaha we have the same thing. We have a police chief and the department, to my knowledge, have never done a town hall community forum in the history of the current administration. The mayor, they all go out there handlers, but I've never seen them do where they go in a community with grassroots and low income folks. Oftentimes they bring in their handkerchief heads and their middle class folks who live out in the suburban areas or in live these houses that are worth a lot of money come down to deal pacify the natives. But again, part of the conversation I think is that if we're serious about challenging our systems, we gotta get these teal tacos and Uncle Tom and bootlickers out of our midst and just ostracize them like you do in Star Trek, the Klingons, turn our backs on them because they're not gonna do us any good. And if we don't wake up and get out of these parades, and again, you got the head of Black Studies who's known for being part of the old school drill team, ain't busted a grape. I haven't seen any publications. How do these guys get these PhDs, already degrees, and they're not involved in our community? They don't write articles. They don't publish editorials. Again, if I'm making it up, take me to court and sue me. But these are useless individuals where I'm wondering at the end of the day, what would their grandkids say about them? What have they done? And again, many of them have gotten off our backs of the sweat of our ancestors who fought for them to get in the doors. When they get in the doors, they lock our hands like they do in India when they get on the train, and they keep the rest of us out. And again, we should have no business in Omaha, Nebraska that has 35% people of color having all white committees in City Hall, county governments, and anything to do with the FBI, the U.S. Attorney, you name it. And then we got people walking around like Lulac and these other handkerchief heads who are not busting the grape. But let's end on that note, and hopefully people look at this show, learn from it, and do something about it. But Patrick, thank you very much for sharing some heavy light. I've had a wonderful time challenging. Hopefully this may wake up the sleeping giants of our community. So thank you. As we always end, may the force be with you, Barocco.
Thank you.